Right, I have two pieces of software I'd like to present. One is called Pod to HTML2, and the other one is called Collection, and Alexander has already indicated something about it. So, okay, why isn't it working properly? Come on, there we go. By the way, I've decided to start calling this Rakudoc, not Pod. Plain old documentation, POD, then became Pod 6. It was written by Damien Conway. But since we've renamed everything else Raku-wise, I decided to call it Rakudoc, although it's really something I suggested. Nobody else is taking it up. So there's going to be references to Pod as well. So people know what it is in a program, as these equal signs and begins and ends. And then you can have a single pod block with one line, like you've got the head one, migrate idea. The next thing is that when this gets compiled into a program, and you can look at it with equals pod, and I heard Leon earlier, he doesn't really like it. But this is a pod structure of the same program with a lot more. So you can see this is it's a lot richer. And in fact, I think Rakudoc is going to be one of the leading contenders for why Raku is important. Rakudoc is actually one of the, I think there are 4 slangs in Raku. One is the regular language, the regexes. The other one is the quoting constructs. Pod or Rakudoc is the third one, and I think the fourth one is the ambient Raku. But nobody wants to see this sort of complexity. What they really want is an output, and they want the output in something like HTML, or they want it in MarkDown. I came along about 3 years ago. I was looking for things to do with my time, and I looked on the issues list for documentation and saw that JJ for a long time has been wanting to have everything in templates rather than in the in Pod to HTML. So I looked at Pod to HTML. I call it Legacy Pod to HTML, and you can see here that something called a formatting code. So there's the B's, the C's, the I's, and then there's some other ones, but mostly we use C. So when you see C open bracket and then a piece of code and then a close bracket, it's a formatting code. And Legacy Pod to HTML just lists them. So you can see this list of the different characters. And then inside of Pod to HTML, it actually decides that if you're going to have a B, then it has to be strong. And it has just assigned these HTML containers to the different codes. The other thing is here at the bottom, you will see that the return, the HTML, the string that is returned is the open, the opening bracket and the closing bracket, but there is no possibility for a CSS class. And since a lot of modern HTML is to do with classes and with CSS and being able to have a lot more flexibility, this whole construct is very rigid. So what was required? We wanted to be able to have the output formatting in a user accessible form. So we wanted to have templates that you could see and you can manipulate yourself without buying into a particular set of templates, but obviously a generic default set of templates. We also wanted to have custom blocks. Now, Pod to HTML does not allow at all for custom blocks, but it was in the original specification of Pod. In other words, suppose you wanted to have an image or a graph, you would just put equals image, and and the user should be able to include something that the pod renderer would then take up and create an image. Similarly, we would want to have custom format codes. So, for example, F is not used in the specification, but when I write my website, I would love to have icons from Font Awesome, and I would like to have them just appear in my code. And then an easier code structure to follow, because Pod2HTML is a bit of a tangled web. So this is the structure I came across. First of all, I did put templates into Pod2HTML, so it uses mustache templating for the top level. And that was code that I'd put in and I adapted, but I saw that the lower levels and the iterated levels, without changing the whole of the program, you could not simply put templates into Pod.html. You had to change the very structure of the renderer. So I extracted the processing of Pod into something called Pod Render. And essentially Pod2HTML creates, is just a thin filter over the top, a thin class over the top of ProcessedPod, and it provides the templates and custom blocks. So image is a custom block that is described within Pod2HTML, but the new Pod2HTML2 doesn't allow you to put custom codes in unless you go through some extra work. When you have a pod tree and you push it through ProcessedPod, you actually get 4 or 5 different outputs. The first output is the rendering into HTML. You then get a table of contents, and the table of contents can be manipulated. And according to the original specification, you could put the table of contents at the beginning, at the end. You could have small tables of contents and so on. Then there is index data. Now, we heard a rant from Alexander. I didn't agree with him about the X format code entirely, because I use X quite extensively, but it does create information about, there is information within every pod file of all of these links. So these are indexes, so you can have anchors in the text that can be used in an index or in a glossary. So you would have a list, a glossary, and then you could go to that part where, for example, say is in a variety of different pages. And then there are links, and then something I haven't put in here because the space was getting a bit limited, is that every pod file, every Rakudoc file in the documentation system, and there's several hundred of them, have some metadata at the top called kinds and metakinds and categories. So there is a data structure that contains, for each of these categories, the files that are associated with the category and that metadata. Now then, one of the things that I discovered right at the very beginning is that actually there are 2 things. There is a Rakudoc, that is a single file. Within the single file, you will have a table. You can create a table of contents that is from all of the headers, and an index from all of the X marks, XX markup. But what happens when you've got hundreds of documents? Well, you actually need to have some sort of block that describes the collection. So you have a table of contents of each file, but you also need to have a table of contents for the entire structure. Now, the problem is that there is nothing defined in Rakudoc in Pod 6 about group files. So let's call them group files, or sometimes I call them structure files. How is this handled by Raku, Raku.org? Well, the language page, if you can see here, this is the standard language page. And on it, this sort of structure that you see here, which is, what we would normally see. All of this page is generated programmatically by Documentable. It is not available in a user accessible form. And all of these items here are all part of the program, the programmatic generation. There was an attempt to write a configuration file in JSON, I think it was, or in YAML, about 4 years ago, where all of these were listed, and then document HTMLify took out that list and then generated this language file based on the JSON file. That seems to me to be wrong. We need to have a Rakudoc blocks for describing the collection of data, the metadata of a group of files. Another problem is the homepage for Rakudoc, and that is this document here. You will see here there is a little pencil, and that means that you can go in and you can edit it. Here you will see there's no pencil on the language file because you can't edit it. It's not editable. It's a generated file. I ask people to look at the source, and you will find that it is simply an HTML file. So programmatically generating group files means that you either fix the algorithm or the metadata for collecting it. You haven't any other way, so it's fixed. You can't change it. And so there were some issues about categories and how would we express them on the language page. And those become very difficult conversations because there is no easy way to experiment with different categories and see how it all fits. It's all within the algorithm. Configurations in YAML or JSON means that you've got another file type. You have to deal with, another file. Grouping can be done for one format. That is, suppose that you want to output everything in HTML, but what if you want another format, such as EPUB or PDF, you have something LaTeX, for example, you want a book in another format, you have to create another renderer for that format. So my solution is that all content files are called a collection, and the group files for a collection are written separately, and the group files for each output is separate, because if you're writing a book, you may want your content, you may want a forward, you may want some information about the chapters to be in a different way, expressed in a different way than when you do things with HTML. And the other thing is that I began to write structure files. I began to write custom blocks that would take the information that is gathered and display it in a much more concise way. So if you now look at raku.finanalyst.org, this is the current, I'll show you that URL in a minute, but it's working. So I basically have taken all of the Rakudocs, the pod files on the Raku site, and recreated it into a file. And for the purposes of creating collection, I mimicked the existing file. So, kudos to Alexander and all of the work that he has done to change the website. I wasn't intending to change the website. I was trying to create something to create a better website in a sense. I wanted to replace, the old legacy tools with something that was a bit more flexible. The next thing is here. So this is an example of the pod. So here at the top, list files. List files is a new block. It's a pod block, and it takes a set of a set of parameters in the select key. Here at the end of the line, at the beginning is the title for list files that will appear in the content. So at the beginning is the first one. So you can see here at the beginning, that appears in the table of contents. That is the header of this particular section. And then the file itself, the content of this section, is generated from the data that has been collected by going through all of the hundreds of files that are there. So the whole of the first page, which extends downwards, I haven't put it all on here, the whole of the first page is written in Rakudoc, and this is the entirety of it. From the beginning pod to the end pod, this is the whole of the first page. The top, the table of contents and everything else, all of that is generated from templates. But the thing that you want to change, in other words, you can change the order, you can change the naming of these different headers. All of that can be changed in the Rakudoc. Next. So there's an indexed file in collection. And that now here is also, instead of being written in HTML, it's written in Rakudoc. Camellia is a plugin that basically has the icon. HR, I liked these little dots at the top and here. That was done by customized CSS. In Rakudoc, so I just created a new class for HR, and everything else is just basically an item. All of these are just standard Rakudoc. Collection goes through a series of milestones. First of all, it collects the source and caches it. It collects the mode data, the structure, and caches it. Then it runs programs for rendering this, rendering the source, for setting up the source. So, for example, the directories are listed with capital letters, but the files, when they are referred to, are listed with lowercase letters. So there has to be an alias inside the Rakudoc to map from uppercase to lowercase. And then compilation, you render it, then you compile it, and the compilation is when you gather information from everything else. Next, we go to support technology. So I rewrote, I wrote pod from cache to pod, and then I wrote pod from cache. I've also written something called Raku Config. I don't like using JSON for config files. I like having everything in Raku notation, not JavaScript notation. So I call it, it's Raccoon. It's Raku object notation, and it's basically just pulling in everything that's in a Raku config file. I found that template mustache was working very slowly, so I wrote a template language based on Raku closures that works much faster. I have another template. I liked CrowTemp, which is the template used for Crow. So I've tried to adapt that. So Collection will use any of 3 different templating technologies. Suppose you want to add a custom block. So here we have something called HR, and we want to put a class with HR. I've created a plugin called Simple Extras under Raku. There's something called Raku Collection Raku Documentation, and Simple Extras is a plugin there. There's a config file. There's CSS that is accompanying the files. There is extra blocks. There are templates, and everything has to have a README. So where to go? What I want to do is to create a website management system that can manage multiple languages, not English as the first language and then everything else is added on top of that. I want English to be one of a multiple set of languages, and I want the user interface and the content to both be in multiple languages. I'm fed up of writing multiple language things in English and then having to add on top of that another language, and then finding that all of the templates have to be translated as well because the templates have got all sorts of languages in it. I also think, and here is where I want to talk about Rakudoc. I think Rakudoc is underestimated by the Raku community. Most websites are written where the content is written in MarkDown, which is not a very rich language. And when you're dealing with complex documents, such as manuals, such as my website, so I've tried to create a website. I've had to use something called Grav CMS, and I dislike it because I have to keep looking at PHP and Twig and all sorts of other technologies that are really quite awful. And what I wanted is something that was in Raku, that was based in Rakudoc, and I could use it simply, and I would write all of the plugins in Raku. I wouldn't need to go shifting from one language to another in order to get my website to work. So there we are. That's why Rakudoc is it's most of the metadata is easily visible and editable in the documentation itself, to the extent that you can write a very sophisticated document in Rakudoc and then have it with all sorts of metadata associated with each block, and then have it rendered either in PDF or in LaTeX or in HTML or whatever. How long did it take? Well, it took me a couple of minutes, 3 minutes, to cache all of the documents from the Raku documentation system. It takes 5 seconds to cache all the structure files. It takes 47 seconds to render all of the content. It then takes 3 minutes to, I have a test, and I'll show you the results of the test. So for every single link in the files, in the Raku documents, I test every link to see if there is a response, a valid response or not. And that takes 3 minutes. And then finally, I render the structure files, which takes another two seconds. Right. I now want to show you, I'm going to switch off the stop share and then share my browser screen and show you you should be able to see now the browser screen. Now, this is Raku at finanalyst.org. And if we go to here, this is the original documentation site. So you can see I've just copied the field, more or less copied it. I know lots of people are complaining about it. I'm not a website designer, so to speak, but I didn't want to have, I was trying to aim at exactly the same thing to show the capability of of collection. So here are the errors. You can see that there are now several errors where there's problems with the there are 404. This is another pet peeve of mine. There are a lot of entries that go to what Alexander was saying before, index entry, quote words. This actually is a new file that is created by Documentable. It's not the original file, and all of these links are to virtual files. I'm not going to go into that. I ranted at that ad nauseam. But what I did want to show you to end are some of my plugins. So here we have some new classes for standard HTML. So if you have HTR, by the way, this equals 4, and then the name of the block is standard Rakudoc, but it means that you can assign metadata to the block. It's similar to begin. It's similar to a single line. After 4, on the next line, if you put a line, then that is included as the contents of the pod block. I've introduced the idea of keeping plugins together. So here we are. Often I want to have a paragraph that is different from the standard paragraph, but I don't want to have to recode the whole template. So I've got another template called quotation. I actually wrote it as I was listening to the conference. And you can see paragraph. I've got an author and I've got a citation. And as you can see, it's now standard Raku pod, and it gets rendered into HTML like this. I've mentioned about having icons, and so font awesome icons I love. I'm using 4.7. That's the last version of 4. I know there's 5 and there's 6, but I haven't written the plugins for those, so that's a work to do. But you can see this is an example of how to put it into pod. You put F, and then you put the name of the icon, and it renders as the icon and part of the text. Font Awesome has some other options. You can have some triple size. You can have it rotating. You can do some other things with Font Awesome. All of these are included in this by including it into the extra information into the format code. So I put in as an issue for the future that all format codes should have this structure where you have the main data and then you have metadata accompanying it. That is not a part of standard Raku pod. It's part of my renderer, pod renderer. So the compilation blocks. Here we have this list files, and it's listed. Now, you want sometimes for this to appear in the table of contents, and sometimes you don't. So within here, you can see if you put this metadata into a block, it will not be put into the table of contents. Here's an image that I've just, associated with the file, and it gets put into image, and there are some justify left or float right, float left that goes with image. That's with this. This actually is part of pod to HTML2. You can use this straight away. I also like jQuery plugins, and I'd like to incorporate them. So, for example, filter lines is a plug with list files is a plugin that has list files as the block, and if you put into the box, the search box, it then compresses the lines. This is part of a standard jQuery. It's actually the way in which search is implemented in the script for standard Raku. The next thing is that I like to have maps on my plugin on my web pages. So I have got a map plugin. And as you can see here for Leaflet Map is a fabulous. Don't go to Google Maps, they're appalling. Leaflet Maps is a lot better, and it uses multiple sources. You can see here that if you want to have more metadata associated with a block, standard Rakudoc allows for metadata to be spread across different lines by using the equal sign. So this is just a leaflet map without any information. Since I live in Cardiff, it's based on Cardiff Castle. But this is Edinburgh Castle here, and that's the center of the map. But now, if we want to have different providers, so this is telemetry from Esra. It's you've got the trees. This is satellite imagery. It's actually not quite useful to have just the map. You want to have some markers. So here are some markers, leaf markers, and as you can see, I have included font awesome icons onto the map in various places, and because they can twist, I've got them twisting. The other thing is that there was in the Rakudoc, there are these graphs that show the different levels of the classes and where they come from. All of that information is done separately to Rakudoc, and it has to be sewn in by documentable or something else. I wanted it directly in Rakudoc, and so I have taken GraphViz. I've produced a little block header, and this is the graph that is generated from the digraph content here. Right, I think I have to finish now, so I will stop sharing and start talking. Thank you. You like that?
I like it a lot.
Good.
It makes a lot of things clear to me that I didn't understand before. Thank you very much.
Yes. I'm not a very good explainer sometimes in my things, so.
A picture tells 1,000 words, and these were many thousands of words to me, yes.
Yeah. As I said, I think that a lot of what Alexander is doing should be, accessible through collection as opposed to documentable. And I actually think a lot of what he's done can be done through these plugins. Sorry, Patrick, I think you were the first, and then Anton's next.
Okay, hi. I'm also very, very impressed, I must say. I really like what you did. Do you know about the things Alexander Zahitsky, I think he's called, did with Podlight?
Yes, I have spoken to Alexander. His is all in net, and when I write my content management system, I will have the Raku Pod will be edited using his Podlight.
Great. it's good to know that people know the relevant other people.
Yes. No, I've spoken to him. His plugins don't work the same way as my plugins, but he does have customizable blocks as well, and that's why. So I could see that it wasn't just me; it's part of the specification of Rakudoc, and it's never been implemented. So I have implemented it.
Great.
Anton? Sorry.
One more.
Yes.
Do you think this could be used as a basis for getting some form of module documentation on the web?
Yes, I want that. So the only thing that what I want to do is to have a tab where you would click on it and it would show you the documentation files for your modules that you have installed locally, rather than all modules that exist. Okay, because I think that's what Rakuland does. But I would love to have internally all of the documentation files of all of the modules that I have locally installed. So that is one of my aims. The biggest problem is that I can't work out how to get access to them using Zeph or pre-comp mod. I know it's there, I just haven't yet worked out how to do it. Anton?
Yeah, thank you for your talk. So 1 year ago, I was thinking to document with pod 6. Then I decided to just use Markdown, but now I'm going to use Rakudoc, right? Yeah, there are some very nice features you presented. One of the questions is free, like GraphViz, and there's a standard fairly well-known UML renderer called Plant UML. It's based on GraphViz. I think this would be very nice to kind of include.
Yeah. So what I've done is I've started a module called plugins, collection plugins. It isn't yet completely the way I want it to be, but I want to be able to make it available to everybody, so everybody can write their own plugins. They're very simple to write, and then we can sort of have users rather than me writing everything.
So, well, then LaTeX. So LaTeX would not be a trivial plugin to write, but
no.
Right. There is is it possible to do multi-language support from a programming language perspective? For example, especially with this code generation, whatever kind of stuff I'm doing, can try to evaluate, say, code.
Yeah. That is something another project that I want to do. I want to write a language in Welsh, since I live in Wales, so that school children who learn in Welsh, and there are Welsh learners in schools, that they can write their little programs that says dweda, meaning say, and then dweda mae hi'n hyfryd iawn, and then that would be pre-processed as Raku, but that's not part of Rakudoc, that's part of Raku, and I think that actually would be a killer application, because if we can do it for example, Welsh, then we could do it for Chinese, and then suddenly the whole of the Chinese population could start programming in Raku using Chinese letters. And for it then, but that's another project, so that's another talk.
No, but yes, and it's because you're doing the multi-language perspective anyway. I was going to say, need to support it from the other end. So
yes,
right,
I agree. Anybody else? I don't see any other hands. Okay. Well then, thank you. Do I just hand back? Thank you. Okay.